mean, first of all, I want to thank everybody for having us here. It's my first time here, so it's quite interesting because you always wonder, like, what kind of art is addressing what in which society. So, of course, coming here, the reading of Adel's work is very differently than when I saw it in the Jeu de Paume or if I see it in the gallery. So you have to understand, like, resistant to what, as you said. And for me here, it's really amazing to see the exhibition of Adel. It has a very different kind of expression with the space as such, with the quality of the space. It's much more hard, it's much more straightforward, the light is much more bright, and the walls are much more white. And I think it's very crucial, because then if you say this resistance becomes more visible. Also, it's very interesting because Adel says about his work is work from the street. He's a street boy. He's kind of like, what he brings into the space comes from the street. So I think it's interesting to see what kind of worlds, what kind of languages, and also what kind of viewers are meeting in this moment. I would be very curious to see how Adel can resist also the notion of appropriation. Because, of course, the moment we are entering institutions context, there's kind of like counter-resistances and appropriations on the stake. And I'm quite curious in which way we kind of dealing with the statements of an artist like Adel in such a context. And we were discussing the piece with the chicken. Of course, like how do we deal with such a statement, and how do we deal with it here versus how would we deal with it if it's shown in the Pompidou or elsewhere. And this kind of resistances were also at the core when I met Adel, when he had the show at the List. And of course we had a lot of debates exactly about Adel kind of also resisting certain conventions sometimes, what's possible, and he has no problem of sometimes also of being embarrassing in the sense of exposing something very directly and straight away. So he's resisting maybe also the smoothing down.
I like also to consider this other aspect. I was saying before, just before, that the model of Western culture, or at least the Western art in this moment is a moment of big crisis. And even if this model has become dominant all over the planet, in the same time it's losing its effectiveness and its substantial power in a way. So I'd like to address this time David Elliott, who, as you have been told, has passed from a country, England, as the director creator in a way, no, of Museum of Modern Art, Oxford. After 20 years of directing that, he passed to Moderna Museet in Stockholm, one of the leading museum in Europe, a model of museum in Europe, as it was before it the Stedelijk Museum in Amsterdam, or the other model that is not European, the Museum of Modern Art in New York. So Stedelijk, Moderna Museet in Stockholm, created and directed for many years by Pontius Sultan. It is one of the last models of European museum, and he was there as director for a couple of years. So Sweden, we are still in Europe, but we are a little bit above Europe. I don't know. There is a certain kind of distance. You can see you're not embedded in the ambience of Central Europe and not embedded also in the ambience of Mediterranean Europe. You are just above there, and you can see things from the distance in a very clear way, and you can make your own history, your own receipt of history. And then from there he moved to Japan, to Moriarty Museum, from Japan to Istanbul, even quite shortly. And so I say, what has changed in the Western art that make you move out of Europe? And what is that you find in Adel Abdessemed? You find something that is a sign of this crisis, or the affirmation of this of the crisis itself?
Yeah, I think it's not so much that Western art's in a crisis. I think that the whole Western model is in the crisis. And basically what I've been living through, as indeed we all, is the kind of running down of the consensus of the European Enlightenment, which actually created a power nexus around the Atlantic Rim. And this was a nexus of population growth, knowledge, technology, ideas about politics. I mean, the first revolution was in America, then the French, and then they couldn't stop it. And then there was this horrible idea of nationalism, which sort of picks on it, because we have human rights, and if you coagulate people together, coagulated their rights, they make a nation. So there's all this idea about national self-determination, purity, race. I mean, this didn't really exist before. Completely new ideas. And we've seen, really, theories of governance come forward. We got rid, in Europe, of all-powerful monarchy in the 18th century and through the 19th century. And really, there were other ideas that came forward. One was a kind of freedom, a Tory view, one would say, which is really to do with the freedom of the individual and the economic freedom of the individual. The other was the collective view. Well, the collective view more or less went fut in 1989 when the Berlin Wall came down. It kept going in China, but it sort of converted itself to the other view, the independent, let's say capitalist view, which continues. And now that's obviously not working very well. And art's part of that. And I think looking at Adel and his response to this, to the end of empires, the rights of the individual, but also the abominations that are done in that name of the rights of the individual. We're not talking so much about Adel Abdessemed against the world. We're talking about Adel Abdessemed against himself, because he's smart enough to realize that that is where this kind of problem will start.
Yes, another thing that I like, in this case I'm addressing Hans Ulrich Obrist, we are talking before we entered this room, and he was busy with métissage and métissagization. And métissage is quite an important issue. For instance, there is whole areas of the planet where métissage is the main form of culture. I think in particular Latin America, where the paradise is lost forever, and where the attraction, the attraction for Europe is so strong, and so it's a sort of no territory, no place, because what it was is disappeared, and what you aspire to have is something distant, and it's the origin of your colonizator. So it's a sort of void that you create there, and métissage, this kind of thing, is the form of culture that you have in this area, much more than in other areas of the planet, like Asia or Africa. So even in the case of Adele, well, there is not so much this idea of métissage, but where different sources of culture and information are coming together, creating the primal impulse to his work. Not only in terms of, in aesthetic terms, not only in physical terms, in material terms, but also as a sort of impulse to create the work, the motivation of the work in itself. So, Hans Ulrich.
Indeed, is it working? Now it's working, yeah. Indeed, it's a great pleasure and privilege to be here and part of this discussion. And somehow, I kind of thought when we discussed beforehand, you know, this issue of métissage, creolization, etc., about this very strange coincidence, because I met Adele in the mid-90s and had to do actually with a complete coincidence, because I was neighbor with Fabrice Hibert, and Fabrice Hibert is the artist with whom Adele at the time worked. They didn't have a real collaboration, but I think Fabrice had exhibited Adele, so I saw the very beginning of his very first videos and his early work. And the kind of same week I met Adele, I was introduced to Edouard Glissant. And these two encounters somehow for me were always together. And it's obviously Glissant who pioneered very much this idea of creolization, métissage, but also the idea how much this connects actually to the archipelago, no? The Antillean archipelago geography, which is so important for this whole idea. And I found this quote here of Glissant where he says, "The American archipelagos are extremely important because it was in these islands that the idea of creolization, that is the blend of cultures, was most brilliantly fulfilled. Continents reject mixings, whereas archipelagic thought makes it possible to say that neither each person's identity nor the collective identity are fixed and established once and for all. I can change through exchange with the other without losing or diluting my sense of self." And it is this archipelagic thought that teaches us this. No? And I think that's somehow very much the idea of diversity, an antithesis somehow to a continental thought, to a homogenizing thought of continents. And in this sense, Glissant always said the 21st century will be a kind of a creolization, will be a métissage. And it's so fascinating if one looks, for example, at Adele's kind of biography. I mean, from the very beginning of his first experiences, when he talks about anxiety and storytelling, no, the amazing stories also, which actually his grandmother told him, at the same time a young group of Algerian artists having met in Batna, but then also the Encyclopedia of Diderot, which was a real source of inspiration for him. No? The first time he realized that actually something could be communicated maybe through drawings and not only through words, which for him, as he told me, being dyslexic, was an incredible epiphany. Then, of course, Joseph Beuys, and that's the amazing thing how in so many different contexts all over the world, Beuys could be a kind of a trigger. He mentioned that really the first exhibition he kind of learned by heart was an exhibition he saw of Joseph Beuys in Algeria, and where he actually would look at it for an entire day and just learn it by heart. And that obviously would then trigger very many things, as his first videos in '95. I mean, one could go on and on and on. I think there are many, many parallels. I think obviously also the involvement of Glissant in the Algerian kind of wars, in the sort of liberty wars. Glissant was a very close friend of Frantz Fanon. And then I was thinking maybe one more point, this sort of whole idea of Adonis. I mean, it's kind of incredible to listen to Adonis and this story Adonis was telling us about energy, and about Adele and energy. And that kind of made me think about what Glissant called la pensée du tremblement, when he said it's this trembling energy, which is always there. And he says that has also to do with utopia, because he says any kind of idea of utopia passes through the thinking of actually tremblement, And he says that has to do, and maybe a quote here, and we always should have different languages in every panel, so I'd like to add here a little bit of French, because we already have the two languages, you know, with Adonis and now our panel, so I thought French would be the third language, because Glissant was always saying we need multilingualism in the world, so at least 3 languages in the room. La pensée qui organise un système et qui essaie de mettre de l'ordre sans ordre dans le monde est une pensée contre laquelle nous pouvons élever ces pensées du tremblement, qui est la connaissance ou la tentative de connaissance réelle de ce qui se passe à l'heure actuelle dans le monde. He says basically that the thinking which organizes in system or tries to put order, its order into the world, is actually the one against which we can put this logic of the trembling, of the trembling energy. So it's against this idea of imposing an order. He says the whole world is trembling. The whole world, physically, geologically, mentally, spiritually, is trembling. Tout monde cherche ce point utopique dans lequel toutes les cultures du monde, tous les imaginaires du monde peuvent se rencontrer et s'entendre sans se disperser ni se perdre. Et je crois que c'est d'abord cela l'utopie, une réalité dans laquelle chacun peut se rencontrer et se rencontrer avec l'autre sans se perdre. Et cela, nous ne pouvons ni le faire avec les pensées impériales ou de domination, ni avec les pensées du chemin systématique vers une vérité qu'on voudrait rejoindre le plus vite possible. So he says, the whole world is trembling, the whole world looks at this point, at this utopic point, in which all the cultures of the world, all the imaginaries of the world can actually meet and can actually encounter without dispersing and without losing themselves. And I believe, he says, that it's above all, that this is above all the utopia, a reality in which everyone can encounter the other and can have this encounter without losing himself or losing herself. And this we can actually not do with any imperial thought or with any thought of domination, nor with any systematic thought, but we can actually do it with this vers une vérité qu'on voudrait rejoindre le plus vite possible. We can reach this by trying to join these truths as fast as possible through this, trembling utopia. Now, another coincidence, not only was this encounter in the mid-90s with Adel and Edouard Glissant the same week, but now, tonight, we are in Doha, celebrating Adel's amazing exhibition. And the same night happens in Paris, the Nuit Blanche, which is co-organized by my friend Chiara Parisi. And as part of the Nuit Blanche in Paris is celebrated Edouard Glissant. So here is somehow, maybe it's more than a coincidence.
Would add something more, identify some more characters than we did in this thing of Adele. It's time to say. I mean, before passing the panel to Jane Farver, for whom I have a special question at the end, okay?
Yeah, the show is called the L'Âge d'Or, and I think this is important. The L'Âge d'Or is the time of Arcadia. It's looking back, and I think one of the first people to write about it was Ovid, the poet, in his poem Metamorphosis. And what do we see in L'Âge d'Or? It's a gilded brass panel with 4 ages of little girls, from very little. It's his daughters as they get older into puberty. It's a retreat back into family, back into self. And I think it's a very moving work. And it's one which is very much not in favor of utopias, other than those you make yourself, not this grand idealistic idea. Now, just looking back to something that Adel talked about, his work, the essential thing is to act, to fight, and create in order to transform the world. Now, how can art do that? It makes me think of a story which a Chinese poet wrote about 400 years before our era, called Zhuangzi, and he was a Taoist. And he said that he had a dream. And he dreamt he was a butterfly, and he was fluttering around from branch to branch, from flower to flower. And then he woke up. And he said, I really didn't know if it was me who was dreaming I was a butterfly, or really I'm a butterfly dreaming I'm Zhuangzi. And this is the order of the transformation of things. So he used exactly those terms, transforming the world, transforming the things. in your mind, in your being, in your consciousness, in your perception. And this is things that art can do, and that's where its power is. And I think Adel talks about power a lot. He's rightly concerned about it. But he shows the many faces, or many faces, there are far more than any person can show. But there's something very moving, I think, in the exhibition. And I think it's a very well installed show as well, Pier Luigi. I think the rhythms and the speed of the way how you go through its spaces, they hit off against each other until you get to the torture chamber in the back room. It's a picture of a mind, it's a picture of inside someone's head, as well as a picture of history and of now. And that, for me, is really what is striking about Adel's work and what I find touching. And it's this, if you like, febrile, this almost trembling approach, but it's trembling with excitement, but also nervousness of what is out there.
But I think Glassdoor also talks about currencies. Yeah. And I think it's about value systems, and the question is like, which value system is the ruling one? I mean, you just said like Western art history or the Western model. It's also, I mean, is the model Western capitalism, is that the model? So I think it really touches to the ground on deeper value systems and who has which value, and when, coming back to resistance, when do we start to become resistant to what we see? And this is why, I mean, the chicken just speaks for a deeper resistance to when we are exposed to certain emotions. And when do we become resistant? And I think that's something Adel really does. I mean, he creates emotions, and I think that's something that sometimes is forgotten today in the art world. Why do people produce art, and why have we been initially interested in the field? So I think that that's something also to remind us, why are we using these languages? And I mean, come back to what Hans Ulrich said about the métissage. The art always has been kind of between cultures, and it has been kind of a language that situates itself in between. And I'm quite curious, like with Large Door, like what kind of like cultural in-between is produced here, and that might be something we also should go back to Abdallah or so, like where is the museum positioning itself here, and like what is the cultural currency that is produced here?